Honestly, the thing that you said is probably the biggest roadblock. Too many people think that sales is something you're born with, and so they don't treat it like a skill that you can develop. And then the other big limiting belief is that founders aren't salespeople, right? And so they'll go through their day and they'll say, well, John, I'm not a salesperson. That's what you do. And by taking that stance, like the line you said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. You're not going to do a good job when you can't acknowledge that you are selling your idea to people. And that is okay, right? Because how are you going to manage a salesperson on your team who's supposed to be offering your vision to people to help them grow if you can't acknowledge the fact that you had to do that first? The idea of Sherpa is that it's an awareness forward sales approach versus being a technique driven sales approach, because none of the techniques apply in a conversation if you're not aware of the space you take up, right? So just like in Kung Fu and in martial arts, you might have the best kicks on the planet, but if I crowd your space and you can't pick up that leg to kick me, I've taken away the tool that you use the most.
Yeah.
Okay, so back up a little bit. Take that step back, create the space you need to use your tools well.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Boom Vision. I'm excited to share today's interview with my new friend, John Small Mountain Hill, who's a sales coach, an author, and founder of Adapted Growth. From being a dedicated student of martial arts and living a past life as a professional poker player, John has amassed 2 decades worth of sales experience, and now he empowers entrepreneurs and sales professionals on how to authentically be a better salesperson. What's the secret to selling more? Are gifted salespeople naturally born for that role, or is it a skill that can be practiced, improved, and mastered? You'll definitely want to tune in to hear how this sales Sherpa teaches his clients how to sell more by simply being human. Let's cue the intro. Welcome to the Boom Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Ye. This show is about how you can thrive. It's when you build success in alignment with your mind, body, and soul. I created this podcast to give you perspectives and frameworks on how to strengthen your mindset and gain clarity in your purpose. It's time for you to live an extraordinary life with vision that you design. Let's get to work. What I honestly value more than anything else is quality. Doing one's best in the manner of the responsibility and the craftsmanship of a number one. This quote was by Bruce Lee. Welcome to episode 24 of the Boom Vision Podcast. Folks, I'm excited to share today's interview with John Small Mountain Hill. John is a new friend that I'm blessed to get to introduce through one of my previous guests, Dan Bennett, in episode 18. I first heard of John when he was a guest on Dan's The Entrepreneur podcast, and my intuition was telling me that I needed to connect with John and invite him on my show. After talking to John for over an hour in our first call, my intuition was right because we immediately hit it off with so many similar interests, and we connected on what sparks joy in our lives. As a brief background, John Hill is a founder of Adapted Growth and author of Selling from Scratch. John has been selling in one form or another for over 20 years. A ferocious seeker of knowledge, John began learning everything he could about selling and communicating better. That led to his passion for helping others find their own levels of growth. He started his sales consulting and coaching company in 2018, and he began co-hosting a podcast called Sales Throwdown in 2019. In his coaching, John combines a motivational mindset with actionable, data-driven processes, a method he uses to coach more than 8 sales teams internationally. He's also written a sales improvement book with plans for more books already in development. When he's not helping others sell more efficiently and authentically, John enjoys spending time with his family, biking, martial arts, poker, and traveling. So without further ado, here's John Small Mountain Hill. John Hill, welcome to the Boom Vision podcast. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, man. I'm excited to be here.
So John, let's start with your origin story. Your origin story is unique and to say the least. And I would love for you to kind of share what journey you've been professionally that led to where you are today.
Yeah, so I'm going to try to give the short version of this because being my age, there's lots of little bitty parts of the story. But essentially, I'd been in sales and waiting tables and a service component for about 10 years. And on the sales side, I'd always done okay. And then I moved into B2B thinking it would also be okay. And that was really the first time I hit my wall as a salesperson. And initially, I reacted the same way all salespeople do, with a bunch of ego. And I almost quit sales completely because I couldn't figure it out. And then a friend of mine who I was training at a martial arts school invited me to go in and meet a coach. And initially I had all the ego, just like I said a second ago. And then I started to think about it in a Kung Fu context, right? Because in a Kung Fu context, I was extremely coachable. And I wasn't in other parts of my life. And so I started to think, if this was a Kung Fu thing, would I go at least try it out? And the answer was yes. So I decided to go meet this coach. We had a great conversation, and it led to me working with that friend and a website design startup that we ran together for about 3 years. And that's where I really kind of took the deep dive into sales as a skill that you can develop. And fast forward to now, I help coach and train new salespeople, owners, so that way they can hire their first salesperson, and we do all the technical consulting that goes along with good selling. Now, that's the very short version of that.
Got it. Now you're known as John Small Mountain Hill. So yes. I gotta ask, where does the moniker Small Mountain come from? What's the meaning behind it? And just some insight.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about leaving web, I knew that I needed a place to kind of put my ideas and thoughts, because I was just thinking I was going to go lead a sales team for somebody else. So I was thinking about having a blog that kind of served as like a resume in my thoughts, because sales is much more of a philosophy than it is like one universal thing that works in all ways. And I wanted to kind of have my thoughts out there to make me finding the next job, the next thing I was going to do, easier. And so trying to figure out a cool name when your name is John Hill, like the whitest of white guy names on the entire planet, was kind of interesting, And then John is a weird name in and of itself. Trying to think of a fun name for this thing I was building. Small Mountain is a way that I get past my speech impediment and my stutter. I have a very fast speaking cadence, and I also have a stutter. And so there's certain things I say very quickly, and John Hill is one of those things. And it makes a lot of people struggle with understanding what the last name is. So they'll say, what? And I'll say Hill again. If it doesn't catch, I'll say Small Mountain, and it always eliminates any of the concerns. So this is just something that like worked in coffee shops and in places where I was having to get my whole name. Well, let's see if it'll work on a website. And it has. It's on the book. It's really good for SEO, and it kind of was just like a serendipitous accident. But that's where it started.
Interesting. Hey, I can relate to that, because before growing up, I'm always known as Ben Ye, but sometimes when I'm saying that, because it's so short, usually you have a follow-up on, what was that again? So then I'll just say my full name, Benjamin Ye. Yep. And so I get where you're coming from when you say that. So John, would you consider the path that you're currently on is a path where you're living your purpose? Do you feel really aligned with this path of sales, or did it take certain inflection points to get to where you are right now? Because it sounds like you had a couple of pivots from before, right?
Yeah, the business itself has pivoted along the way. We've been doing this for 4 years now, and the original version of the site of the business was very different than the stuff we do now. So that has changed. And as far as like this being my calling, I think even 5.5 years ago, I would have argued with you that like this is the thing that I'm supposed to be doing, but this is now the thing I can't not do. Like I'll try to carve off a day for just like mental health and just to be a way to go think and have strategic thoughts and be in silence. And I'm still like thinking about the people that I'm coaching and like how can I help them get unstuck, and who else needs to be hearing about this stuff. Like I can't it's almost fanatical at this point, which is the hard thing, which makes it a hard thing to sell. And we can talk more about that later, but this is the thing I'm supposed to do, and it is in line with the thing that only I can do, is how I think about it now.
Mm. So speaking of sales coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think another acronym is Sales Sherpa, right?
Correct, yeah.
So who do you primarily serve, and how do you best help your clients?
Good question. Once you really take a deep look into selling as a profession, you can see that it's much wider than people want to make it out to be, right? And so there's many different lines to sales. The way that we want to help people is if you're selling something that uses your brain power. Let's say that you do content writing for somebody. You're not going to be able to write a blog, a newsletter, a sales page, anything, and have it have instantaneous ROI. You're not going to be able to meet the expectations immediately, right? These are things that you have to go try, right? You have to go test, right? And that means you have to have trust, because too many people buy things with the wrong expectations. And the reason why they have the wrong expectations is because they're sold with the wrong expectations, right? Because everyone's trying to close every deal. And since we're trying so hard to close all these deals, we're bringing in people who aren't really aligned. And then that causes the pressure that like small people in the marketing and like consulting space deal with, because they're not sure that they can say no. They're not sure what to say no to. And so instead of that, they end up taking on too many different kinds of customers, and it causes burnout and fatigue and specific issues inside of those kinds of businesses. So that's who we help, because in a product sell, honestly, if you put the product into the hands of somebody and it's the thing that they want, you're mostly there, right? With coaching and consulting and agency services and marketing, you can't just put it in their hands. Like you have to work with them, right? Which means you need their time. It means you need their grace, right? If you don't smash it out of the park immediately, which most marketing campaigns don't, you have to do some dialing and some tweaking and things like this. And that means it has to be sold differently, not selling it as a commodity of we promise and here's a guarantee and all of this stuff. It's like, we're going to do the best we can for you, and here's the outcomes we've had for other people. I can't promise we're going to smash this for you, though, because every business is different. Are you interested in trying? That's how we teach people to sell.
So what I got from you, John, is that you're really helping to cultivate the focus on the process and the cadence and the direction first, then really about the tactics and everything else in terms of what it is. Because it sounds like it's not just mindset first, but it's really, you want to do it in a way that's in alignment with who you are, because otherwise, if not, then the person you're speaking to will know, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much that is the same between any two businesses on the planet, but there's going to be differences between those two businesses on the planet. And when you're really great at sales, you're looking for how you're different than other people and qualifying around those things, as opposed to trying to talk everybody into seeing the value of the thing that you provide, right? Like if we take something like search engine optimization versus pay-per-click advertising, these are two very different approaches to digital marketing growth, and they're going to have different timelines to get traction and different lasting impacts if you stop working with a provider. So if you're really good at selling and you really want to make sure you're only bringing in the right kind of clients for you, you would ask kinds of questions around those things like, hey, how quickly do we need to get traction with this campaign? How long are you looking for impacts after we stop working together, right? Then you can really have some specificity of how they want the growth. And so that way you can figure out if you can meet those expectations.
So let me ask you this, because as we all know in business, sales is literally the lifeline of any business. And even if you're not in business, but let's say you're a leader or an executive of your team, even in that capacity, you have to enroll your team to a certain vision to, like, and so in some cases you can say that's also part of sales as well. And so with that said, I've seen time and time again that for entrepreneurs or executive leaders, usually it's their inner voice, like, that self-doubt that they might think and believe they're not naturally born as a salesperson. Okay. So with that belief, whether it's true or not, but whether you think you can or you think you can't, either way you're right, right?
Yes, that's exactly true.
So what have you found to be the biggest mental roadblock for people, and how do you help them overcome that?
Honestly, the thing that you said is probably the biggest roadblock. Too many people think that sales is something you're born with, and so they don't treat it like a skill that you can develop. And then the other big limiting belief is that founders aren't salespeople, right? And so they'll go through their day and they'll say, well, John, I'm not a salesperson. That's what you do. And by taking that stance, like the line you said, whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. You're not going to do a good job when you can't acknowledge that you are selling your idea to people. And that is okay, right? Because how are you going to manage a salesperson on your team who's supposed to be offering your vision to people to help them grow if you can't acknowledge the fact that you had to do that first? And to your other statement, I agree with you. I make the same statement in my book. The best leaders use the same techniques, the same processes, the same practice that really great salespeople do, because you do have to get them bought in to go deal with rejection and conflict and pain and everything else like this. So if you don't do a good job of that as a leader, you're always going to be firing people and hiring people and frustrated that you can't figure out, find someone who's going to take action. It's one of the hardest parts. So that's why we focus in the area that we do of helping entrepreneurs bring on that very first, the salesperson, right? Because the knowledge gaps are going to be huge. You don't even know what to teach these people on a lot of times. And I'm there to try to facilitate that knowledge transfer, get all that stuff out of the owner's head into the brain of the salesperson so that way they can do their job more effectively, especially early on. Those are the two biggest things. People are born for sales or they're not, which is just not true. And I'm not a salesperson because I'm an owner. Lean into it. Understand what makes deals close, because that is going to be the same stuff that makes your team do the hard stuff when it's time.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. This is sort of two parts. What's the biggest misconception of sales from the perspective of salespeople, and then the other perspective is non-salespeople, like a general public? What would you say? So, depending on which one you want to take first, what do you feel in your experience has been the biggest misconception from either points of those vantage points?
Good question. Really good question. I would say from the outside view is that a salesperson just wants to sell you. They just want to close you. They just want your money, and they're going to lie, cajole, fake themselves, do anything they possibly can to make that thing happen. Most salespeople will tell you that they're not that person. They're not trying to be fake. Sometimes they're uncomfortable in a conversation, so sometimes the way they communicate might not feel authentic to them, which means it's not going to feel authentic to the other person. But I've never met a salesperson who shows up in front of a prospect and blatantly lies about themselves and what their product and service can do. Sometimes they get misinterpreted, but a lot of times it's the vibe of what's happening. Most of what's happening in the conversation is happening at the nonverbal level. So if you're showing up and you're nervous and you're kind of twitchy and you're kind of just can't really get settled, your words aren't going to have the same impact as if you were competent, confident, and you didn't need this business, right?
Yeah.
So that's the outside view. And so it's very interesting because I'm a founder. I do get calls in some networking platforms, but I also have to deal with the sales stigma of, well, John, you just want to talk to me because you want to try to sell me something. Couldn't be further from the truth, because I don't even actually know if you are in a lane that we help with or not. And I am just genuinely interested in people and how they run their business. So that's the outside view. The inside view is that if you try hard enough, you're going to get the deal.
Interesting. If you try hard enough, you can get the deal. Okay. And this is a misconception because
not all deals are supposed to close.
Yeah.
Right? Like a lot of sales coaching, a lot of sales gurus, are just out there talking about just keep following up and keep following up and keep following up and keep following up. If the height of your coaching around communication and getting people to take action is to be a professional pest, you need a better method. Right? Because I know a sales coach, and he brags about how he followed up with a person for 52 weeks and then they bought. You're telling me that's what you're advocating for others? 52 weeks of follow-up, 52 weeks of chasing, as opposed to getting clarity in the first conversation of, is this really something you need? On what kind of timeline? And when should we follow up and have that conversation? It's just laziness, honestly, and people who would rather have hope in their pipeline. So the idea of just follow up and follow up and follow up is because they don't have a better method to help you communicate better in the moment and get the clarity you need.
That's interesting, because I remember back when I was the CEO of a real estate startup, that one of the things we talk about is, yeah, when you are focused on sales, you're not, it's not always a case where you're going to close on the first or second touch point.
Hmm.
And I think there's a statistics, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, John, but there's a statistics I think out there where usually the average close is after 7 touch points,
So
something to that effect. I don't know if that
the
number even if I'm pulling that out of the hat, but like I remember something saying that, and so I think there's a fine line and balance between persistency and enthusiasm versus just going through the motions,
agree
right?
completely. Yeah,
So I would argue just trying once and failing and then moving on next probably isn't really the most conducive
agree with that as well.
in that. But 52, whew, that's also, I guess it just depends on the person you're speaking to. And the word that came to me when I listened to you, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, it's not just follow up, follow up, follow up, but the word that came to me is like it's qualify up, qualify up, qualify up,
Yes,
right?
like you know, there is a sweet spot there in the middle, right? Because I don't advocate anybody to have one conversation and just let it die, right? Because you do need to put in a little bit of focus. Because the other thing to be considerate of is just how much our attention is pulled in 50,000 different directions, right? All these social media apps that want your notifications, so they're asking you to turn on pings and notifications in your email and all these other things. And salespeople are going to be the bottom of the barrel, right? Until you get them to a place to where they really know that they need this and it's no longer a nice to have, but it's a must have. When you get to that point, you're not doing an email that says, hey, I'm just checking in and hoping for the best. You have agreements, you have the timeline, you know when you're getting started, you know the other things that are on their timeline that might make this thing implode. Because like that is what good relationship selling is. It's about looking for those traps and those pitfalls versus hoping that they don't apply to this deal. Like that's how you save time, is by being very intentional with how you spend it, the questions you ask, and do I need to spend more time with this person? Does this person need a proposal from me? Well,
Yeah.
did they ask for one, or did they say yes whenever I asked them if they wanted one? Because these are two different situations completely.
Yeah. Man, it's funny because as I'm listening to you talk, John, it reminds me of a personal story of mine where there's one point where the used car that we bought for my wife, it was a Mercedes GL. It came to close to the end of the life because it had so much maintenance problems towards the end. I mean, it was already more than like 10 or 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
But long short of it is we needed to retire that car and we needed to get a new one. And we went shopping around all different SUVs because, we had a second baby coming on board. So we needed something bigger than just a
Yeah.
regular four-door SUV. And after going through like 4 or 5 different car dealerships, I remember there's one that my business partner recommended, which he got his car at, and it was like a Land Rover, right? And
Mm-hmm.
this gentleman, because it came from a warm referral, there's already that sort of half-baked in
Trust.
trust, right?
Yeah.
And then I remember going there, and he was showing all the different models, and the deal breaker for us was more of the car because we needed a third row because our in-laws come over and we needed that extra passenger capacity. And when you put up the third row for most cars, there's literally no more cargo space,
Yeah.
right? And that was the case for the Discovery, I think the Land Rover. But what was really surprising about the interaction with the salesperson is that once he realized, like, okay, because we told him, like, we wanted something that had some cargo space. And it's like, yeah, I could show you these, but it really just doesn't fit. And, as he was just listening in terms of like, what is it that we need? And so, yeah, I got to be able to retire this and everything. And he's like, he pulled into the office, my wife and I, and just like, hey, look, like, honestly, if you were to sell your car here and do a trade-in, you're not going to get the value. You're better off actually going to like CarMax. So they will actually probably pay top dollars for what it is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
just give them a call, give them a check. It's pretty easy. And I followed his advice and I literally got like, I think like 1,500 or 2,000 more. And I told him with that, like, hey, even though I'm not your customer today, but not only have you made me a fan, I was like, look, you actually saved me money. I'm gonna come by and drop off a bottle of wine for you. And that's what I did. I bought a bottle of wine, came over, and he's like, wow, no one's ever done this. But I'm like, like you came from my partner and you really helped me here. And I remember that relationship that was being
Yeah.
built. And that to me made me understand, okay, this is why I knew my partner vouched for the guy because it's just even though I didn't have the right, he didn't have the right solution for where it is today, but it's about building that relationship, and it's that trust first. It's
Yep.
qualify first and trust first. And even if you can't help the person across from you at that very moment, you can still serve in other ways, and that still would build trust, right?
Yeah, a friend of mine, a guy that I went to high school with, and I think largely that part of my ability to appreciate sales comes from this relationship. His dad worked for Sewell and still does. He's been there for like 30 something years, which is unheard of in car sales. Like people don't stay for this long.
Hmm.
And he was always talking about like cool stuff that he did for his clients and like always trying to help them out the right way. And what's terrible about the whole thing is most people hear used car sales and the view of the salesperson goes to the most toxic, brutal version you can possibly imagine because that's what they normally experience. But you had a great interaction with a used car salesperson who was, this is what I think of being a Sherpa. Like they are guiding you to the best outcome for you, even if it doesn't match up with their short term best fit for them, because the best fit for them is getting you to buy right then, right there, contain the transaction, get it done, get the deal done, and then move on to the next one. Because he took the long-term play. He's going to help you today, even though it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to help his wallet because he's leaning into the relationship.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lot
100%.
that kind of goes into that, being able to think about it. It's part of the sales culture. It's part of your own personality and how you view sales and relationships, but it's tied to like any number of things. But man, what a rad interaction with like a used car salesperson. I have
Yeah.
never had and I love going to like used car lots because I'm always kind of curious as to like how people do it.
Mm.
I've had some of the worst used car sales interactions, right, which I didn't use for my content because it's just very interesting. But yeah,
Mm.
a lot of them are not focused on the long term; they're focused on the short term, which is help me get paid right now in the most possible way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, in this case, the gentleman actually it was for new cars rather than used. But in any
Still, yeah,
case, still,
yeah.
like it left an imprint enough for me to remember, and just like hey, later on in life, if I'm ready to buy a Land Rover, it's like I'm going to you, man.
And
That's what I
then
literally told him.
here's my really favorite thing about this, right? Is that you gave this guy potentially something for him to hold on to so that way he saves time in his future interactions. Okay.
Mm.
So he lost a deal essentially because he doesn't have a car that you can have third room plus space. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So I would be using that as a potential disqualifier in some of my other conversations if I find out that someone has a family. Hey,
Right.
I'm curious, how important is it that you have third row seating and still have storage? Super important. I've got a concern. Maybe you don't need this. Maybe you need to go minivan route.
Yeah.
Should we talk about it? And think about how much time they would save and how much trust they build because they
Yeah.
knew to ask that question earlier as opposed to being blindsided with it at the back end of the thing. And then they have to get into this kind of adversarial, let's overcome the objections. You can't make
Right.
someone overcome an objection. They decide to overcome it themselves based
Yeah.
upon the relationship and trust they have with the salesperson.
Yeah. Totally, man. So, John, we talked about it briefly, but I think not really a lot in depth in a sense of your diverse background. I mean, because you have
Yeah,
such an immersion in martial arts. You also were at one point a professional poker player,
I
right?
was. Mm-hmm.
And so, with that said, and now being a sales Sherpa, is it okay if I call you sales Sherpa? Because
It's way better than sales coach. I'll go out and take sales Sherpa.
I like the energy behind that, behind
Thank
those
you.
words. And I'm always big on energy behind language, as my audience knows. So, what does mind, body, and soul mean to you, given the variety of experiences and disciplines you've cultivated over the years?
Man. So a big part of this comes from the martial arts thing because, like I said, that was the first area where I was really coachable. And for a long time, if I'm being really honest, Ben, I was the guy that I wouldn't want to coach on a sales team now. Like I wasn't fully invested. Like I just
Hmm.
thought I was having these conversations. If I show them the value components they're going to buy, if this makes sense to me. And unfortunately, that's not how buying works. Buying is an emotional process, and we justify it with intellectual things later on. Like I'm sure that if you'd bought this Land Rover, which is not a cheap car, you would go around talking about the relationship with the salesperson and how great it was and the deal you got. That is us justifying things later on
Hmm.
using logic. But in the heat of the moment, it's an emotional component to make that decision to open up the wallet and buy. And so if we don't do a good job of thinking about those kinds of things, the emotional component, we don't ever make a real human connection with the people that we're talking to and the people that we're trying to serve. So from like the mind and body component, I was kind of frozen out of a lot of the stuff that really helps me in my calls and my relationships now by leaning into the relationship and the small talk and the soft skills and the really wanting to do the right thing for these people. Like my motivation is part of what makes the calls go as smoothly as they do, because I'm very clear on my intention before I start the call, right? If you're just trying to sell something to somebody when they hit the call, it's very hard to run a very great sales call. You have to be really, really, really great as a salesperson, right? So having clear intention is important. And that was the thing that I got both from my Kung Fu background, because your intention in the altercation is going to be the thing that separates you from being able to perform well or not, right? So we always talked about, I want to do just enough to go home. Like, I'm not here to put on a show. I'm not here to put on a clinic. I'm not here to show you how great I am or like how long I can go without being hit. I am here to end this altercation and go home. That's different than, well, let me show off for people. Let me chase these hands. And it shows up a lot more in poker, because I was a professional poker player and I had a coach there. And he said one of the lines that I think about all the time: you will improve based upon the questions you ask yourself. Which, like, the minute he said it, I was like, I don't even know what this means, man. Come on, you're my coach. I'm hiring you to help me win more hands. And he goes, man, if you're looking back at these hands and you're like, why didn't I win? Why didn't I win? You're potentially asking yourself the wrong question. I was like, what do you mean? And he goes, maybe you didn't even need to be involved at all. Maybe you could have folded. And I was, I want to win as many hands as possible. And he goes, that's not what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that you're a winning poker player. And I had to go sit with this for a little bit, because like I wasn't really ready to hear this information. It kind of threw me for a loop, and I was kind of mad. Like, what am I paying this coach for? Right? So I left. I kind of had to sit with it for a bit, and come to find out he's true. He's absolutely right. If I'm not putting bad money in bad spots, I have more money to put into good spots. I can maximize my return. And it was the same thing that I was learning as I was becoming a financial advisor, because I went through all those tests as well. Diversify your risk and everything. Like, same thing in a poker concept, right? It's slightly differently applied, but that's where it started for me. Like, you will improve based upon the quality of questions you were able to ask yourself. And so I learned that in poker, and then I applied it to Kung Fu, and I apply it to how I think about things now, because you always have to be questioning yourself as opposed to just taking it for granted, right? And too many people in sales coaching are always putting that weight on the prospect. Screw that person. They didn't know what they wanted. You've got a great offer. Here's the thing. If you talk to 100 people and no one has bought, the common denominator has to be addressed, which is the salesperson. It just has to be, right? And you can have a bunch of sales ego about it, and I've been that person who has it, who's dealt with it. But at some points, you just need to, how are you getting it done? Does something need to change, right? Insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over again, expecting for a different outcome, right? So at some point, you have to think about, okay, let's look back at the actions we've done. Were they helpful? Were they hurtful? Are we bringing in clients? Are we bringing in the clients we want to work with, clients who pay their bills, clients that are easy to work with, or not? And if not, you have the sales problem and you need to go fix it. Like, whether you want to address it or not, it's not going to fix itself.
Yeah. Man, I love that, John, just because it really reminds me also in terms of who I qualify, who I want to work with as clients too. Just because, hey, if you're just here because you need a framework to get you to 7, 8, 9 figures, it's like, well, the work's really, you're still in the driver's seat. I'm really at most passenger, if not speed dial. So at the end of the day, you have to be asking the right questions or different questions to yield different results. And usually at the end of the day, it's going to be your instincts. And I'm just here as a guide. I'm not here to tell you what the answer is. Everyone has a different test.
Yeah.
Right. And usually the qualifier for me is like, hey, did you listen to the first 4 episodes of my podcast? Does it resonate? Because if it does, if it prompts new questions, the question it prompts for you, and we want to understand clarifying questions, that gives me a really good glimpse of, okay, where is their state of mind in terms of what type of questions they ask and where the areas of improvement might be. And that opens up a whole different, more of a collaborative, and like, okay, they really are in true growth mode in a work first, right?
Yeah.
But if it does it, it's okay. It's not for everyone, but then it just tells me I'm probably not going to be the best type of coach and, to empower you, right? So
yeah. that's the whole thing about being a Sherpa, right? Like a couple of years ago, a group of rich white guys had paid the Sherpas to take them up the mountain, right? And the Sherpas deemed that it wasn't safe because of like the way that the weather was progressing and stuff like this. And so they said, hey, we don't feel safe. We don't feel comfortable guiding you up the mountain. We're not going to be able to do it. These guys got mad and sued them because they wouldn't take them up the mountain.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy? Like, we don't want you to die, so we're not going to go up the mountain. And then they get sued because they don't take them up the mountain. That to me is insanity.
It is. It's sad because it just means they're not really. I mean, whatever happened to safety and life first, right? But it's not. Some people just have different priorities, right?
Well, and that's what I tell everybody. You can't guide somebody who doesn't want to be guided, right? And so the way that we sell is very consultative in nature, right? We want to ask lots of questions. We want to make sure it's a great fit. And the number one question I get is, well, John, what if they don't want to answer my questions? Okay. They're essentially showing you that they don't want to work in the way you want to work. So do you really want to try to force a fit? Or should we put this thing down and go find someone else to talk to who's potentially going to be closer to being aligned with you, making your job so much easier during the sale as well as after the sale, during like managing that client, making sure that their expectations are met and stuff like this. It doesn't end at the sell, right? And salespeople know this because they get the brunt of like being oversold all the time, but owners forget about this, right? So I constantly have to like work with owners of like, hey, be careful of the expectations you're setting. And in some cases, the ones you're not talking about at all, because they're going to create it on their own. And if you don't live up to that, it's never going to be their fault. It's going to be your fault. So qualify thoroughly. Make sure you can help them. Make sure you want to lead them up the mountain before you take their money.
Yeah. So, John, I want to do a quick pivot here because you are an author and I love this book. It's called Selling from Scratch, How to Sell More by Simply Being Human. And so, John, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write this book at this given time?
So we were in the middle of, were we in the middle of the pandemic? It's all a little fuzzy now because it's all kind of running together. But yeah, in the middle of the pandemic, I was struggling because that's what happens in these huge things, right? If you had a business in 2008, you struggled then as well, right? It's just part of the process. And me and a friend of mine decided to do a morning show. I was going to be talking about sales stuff. He's going to be talking about marketing stuff. And really, we're just holding each other accountable, documenting the journey because we're both in the middle of pivots and trying to figure it out. And so that accountability unlocked a whole lot of additional productivity, right? Just like it always does, right? Because work will expand to fill the time allotted. So by meeting with this person every day, I didn't know where to hide anymore, right? And we were filming this live and just putting it out on Facebook, 7:45 a.m. every morning Central Time, me and my friend Jake talking about what's on our calendars, how we're going to get through the day. And I just started saying, okay, I'm going to write 1,500 words. I'm going to write 1,500 words. I'm going to write 1,500 words. And I sat down, I kind of came up with the chapters that I thought would be impactful for the book, that I thought might be helpful. And then I started writing 1,500 words a day. And then thankfully, I have an amazing editor, Melissa, who is also my partner. We've been together, it'll be 19 years next month, which I'm just incredibly grateful that she puts up with my crap. And I gave her this word baby. Now, normally the way that we work is I write anything, it goes over to her, and she can kind of look at it and clean it up. And also, hey, we don't need to talk about this stuff. This is way too much of your stupidity, like maybe later. So I gave her this whole big, huge word baby. And I was like, hey, read this and tell me if it's anything. And she was like, okay. So she went and sat down and read it. And I'll never forget this. I'm sitting in the kitchen and I'm just kind of like, I'd moved on with this thing. I'd written it, project done, handed off to someone. I have really great compartmentalization around some things. So it's a Friday afternoon and I'm sitting at the desk in the kitchen and she comes walking in and she was like, this is a book, and just kissed me. It was like one of the coolest like moments. And then we had to go through the whole process of editing and tightening it up and turning it into what it is and everything else, because it didn't start out here, right? So the thing I would tell everybody is to make sure that you're like, you either have a really great editor or you're not part of the editing process yourself, because it'll shut down the creativity that you need to get something like this out of your head. The only way I got it done was forcing myself from the editing process and having a great editor. But there's other ways of getting it done as well. But the book is for like starting the change, starting to remove some of the stigma around sales, because it's so fascinating to me because there's this whole big wide range of B2B selling, and there's a nobility to it. It's a craft, it's a skill. Like people get hired based upon their Rolodex and their network of connections. They'll get six-figure jobs because of who they know and their experience, right? So, and I love that. People who don't see value in sales, or they think that sales is grimy, don't network the same way that like sales focused people do, and it shuts down all kinds of opportunities. So this was really, this is the new norm. Like this is the new benchmark. This is what sales is. And that's why the line in there is, it's noble when you're noble. And if you're not noble, it can't be. So go forward with that knowledge and be brave, because you're going to have to deal with some rejection. You're going to have to deal with people not giving you the time of day. That's okay. You haven't found the right people yet. You got to keep looking.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Is there a particular topic or chapter in this book that you feel can resonate the most with my Boom Vision audience here?
The normal entrepreneur, right, comes from kind of like there's not that many roles that they come from. You're either like a big visionary person and everyone knows you're going to start your own business, or you get really great in a lane and you decide to go out on your own. This is usually what happens. So depending upon your path is going to create some unique hurdles and struggles, right? And so my favorite chapter of the book is called Intentional Selling. And in there, I make the case that introverts, I myself am an introvert, make arguably better salespeople than the extroverts. Because since the extroverts get their energy from having one-to-one conversations, they're going to take any one-to-one conversation they possibly can, and their pipeline is going to show the results of all of those potentially not very surgical approach to the meetings you take and how you qualify them and everything else. An introvert who doesn't get energy from just being around people, they're going to be laser focused about what do we need to do, what are the agreements we need to make, what are the steps in the process that apply to this phase of the sales process and everything else. And what happens is founders they're great at selling, but the thing that makes them great at selling is the fact that they're a founder. So the kind of wackiness, the kind of all over the place, that kind of nutty professor vibe that lots of founders do is warming, if you're going to buy that. The salesperson can't sell that way. They have to sell and approach it differently, right? So the book is for the entrepreneur who doesn't think they're a salesperson, for the salesperson who's struggling in their sales role because they're trying to be all things to everybody. And it's about showing both of those people you get more by doing less. Dial it back, tighten the grip, make the funnel smaller, and you're going to have better outcomes and better longevity in the business.
I like that. Thank you. Yeah, I remember that chapter. So I do want to say this because I remember, John, I texted you over the weekend that I finished it within a weekend, and I can't remember the last time I finished a book in over a weekend. And you asked me about my feedback, and I told you I wanted to save it for this interview. Now, I want to tell you why. There's two things I got out of this. The first thing that came into mind when I read this book, all my audience knows I'm a big movie guy. I love movies, right? I quote a lot of movie quotes. And the first movie that pops into mind was Memento by Christopher Nolan. Now, why did I say that? It's because when I read the book, the energy I felt from it is really, I feel, indicative of where you are in your sales coaching career, in a sense that you're helping people that aren't necessarily in day one of embarking on as a new sales associate, but people that have either been around the block, has a couple of battle scars, they've tried things, but they haven't yet been able to thrive in that next level. Yeah. So from that perspective, it's like when I read through it, that sequence and how you laid it out makes total sense, because then, it's the title says for itself, selling from scratch. And the imagery I get, it's almost like, for people that ever play golf, most likely than not, what do people do? They go to a driver range, they whack a ball. Okay, it goes straight. Okay, I could sort of hold my own. Can I at least average double par, right? Whatever it is. But then you realize, wow, if you don't really elevate and get a coach to really understand how to do it properly, then you're not going to be able to know the nuances and really be able to refine your game. And then when you do get a coach, you realize, oh my God, I've been doing it. My habits I've been forming were all wrong, so I have to redo everything. And so that's what it reminds me of when I read this book, Selling from Scratch. Is like, hey, for someone that has been playing golf for the last 5 years casually, but if you really want to elevate your game, guess what? You got to learn the basics to understand what's the theory, then the practicality, then the actions that go into making that happen. So that's one thing I got. Because what's interesting, why I mentioned Memento, is because if you are someone new, guess what? If you read the last chapter going front, it's a different experience. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Memento.
It's one of my favorite movies. Like, I love Christopher Nolan, and I've never thought about reading, like, going through the book backwards. Now, like, I'm not going to be doing anything the rest of the day after this because I'm going to be thinking about like that. But that's really interesting because we had this very fascinating conversation about the mindset chapter specifically, and
that's right.
I like putting it at the very I'm so, like, not even low key excited about that. I am high key excited about that potential because it wasn't intentional at all. It wasn't something we were thoughtful of, but like, it's pretty rad that you could potentially read the book backwards and still get value out of it. That's cool.
I after reading it, I then looked at the highlights on the headings of each of the chapters and I reverse engineered it, and it made sense. Why? So the imagery I got from this, and guys, I always highlight recommendations of books when my guests come on for interviews and whatnot, but I do recommend this for multiple reasons, guys. And it's because I've read it myself and I believe in it. So why I'm recommending it is because if you're an entrepreneur and you know that sales is your lifeline, that reading it from beginning to end, the way you designed it makes sense to understand how to break it down. Because the imagery I got in reading this, why it was an enjoyable read for me, it's the perspective you gave me on how to view sales is instead of I need to sell something that I have that I think you want, so I'm going to exchange this need and the solution that I'm trying to upsell to you in exchange for money. And I think that talks a little bit about the preconceived notion from outside looking in what people might view sales. Mm-hmm. The way you described it, and I know you didn't use this analogy, but I'm very, like I said, I'm very big on energy and language. But the imagery I got as I finished this book was almost like this. It was like you have people in different islands, and some people need to get off the island, and what you need to do to help them get off the island is to build a bridge. The question is, which bridge and what direction do they want? And once I identify that, then the way I see the sales is, let me help build a bridge for you. And as we're building it, by the way, let's build a campfire right in the middle so I can really get to know you.
Yeah.
And when I see it in that way, it's the building the trust, it's the building integrity. Integrity is the bridge. And it's really just refreshing to think of it from that perspective, because if you are an entrepreneur that you're not a solopreneur and you're growing your team and you do need to hire a sales team, a sales coach, it really lends you a different lens to understand, yes, there's OKRs, there's KPIs, there's things that you need to measure, but what are the leading indicators? But at the end of the day, what type of brand, company, identity, when you use, I'm not sure using is the right word here, but when you do sell to customers, are you selling or are you really building a bridge? Are you building that trust? Are you having a conversation and you're building relationships?
Yeah, man. Like, the 500 ways that I explain that same concept are nowhere near as eloquent as the way that you just talked about it. But yeah, like, essentially the example that I always talk about is salt is a commodity unless you're a chef, right? So if I have to go sell salt and I'm selling a more expensive than table salt, I can choose to go talk to every parent and adult and homeowner that I possibly can. Or if I want to have the best results possible and sell like without having the discount, I need to go talk to people who are going to like immediately see value in salt, which are going to be chefs, right? So that's where like the pure effortness of this falls short, because when you put your head down and just lean into effort, you lose the ability to be strategic, right? And so sales is all about the pools you swim in, as a coach said it to me once, right? So you might have a great offer, you might have a great position, you might have everything else, but if you're in the wrong pool, you might still not be getting any nibbles, right? So you have to be very thoughtful about the pools that you're in and how you're positioning it and how you're approaching it. And then we take it one level past that. The idea of Sherpa is that it's an awareness-forward sales approach versus being a technique-driven sales approach, because none of the techniques apply in a conversation if you're not aware of the space you take up, right? So just like in Kung Fu and in martial arts, you might have the best kicks on the planet, but if I crowd your space and you can't pick up that leg to kick me, I've taken away the tool that you use the most.
Yeah.
Okay, so back up a little bit. Take that step back, create the space you need to use your tools well. To me, at this point, these things are all the same thing. Like sales is poker, is Kung Fu, is leadership, is entrepreneur. So it's very hard sometimes for me to kind of speak at the depth necessary. But if you were trying to get people to take action and you can't force them to take action, you are a salesperson, right? And if you're a parent and you're trying to get your kids to go do the right things and eat their veggies and do their studies, you're selling them on the fact that like they need to do good things around their education, right? So Dan Pink talks about this in his book, To Sell is Human, and we push it a little bit further here. If you can't acknowledge the agenda that is in your conversations, either networking or sales or partnerships or being a parent, you're putting yourself at the position to where they're only going to be used against you.
Yeah. Gotcha. Well, so with that said, my next question was actually asking you, aside from your book, which again, listeners, I highly recommend this. Go pick it up. I'm including the show notes and stuff, so it'll make it easy for our audience to be able to pick it up. In addition to your book, is there another book you've read in the past year that has been transformative in your life that you can recommend for our audience?
I'm a big reader, so it's hard to narrow this down to one book.
First one, go with your intuition. What's the first one that comes into mind?
The most powerful book I've read in probably the past 5 years is called Leadership and Self-Deception by a group called the Arbinger Institute, and they have a couple of other books in the same kind of format. And essentially, it boils down to the main thing that when you're a leader and your first decision is flawed, none of the rest of the decisions can be good decisions, right? So if you make a decision, man, this person is on their way out because they're just not getting it, and then you act in ways to make that true, you're still at fault because maybe that first decision was about you didn't give them good instructions, good training, good onboarding, right? So we have to be thoughtful about these chains of decisions that we make as leaders and entrepreneurs and as salespeople because they're all tied together. And if the first one is flawed, this person needs me. Yeah. Watch this, right? And then at the end, you're trying to discount to get them to close. You're committed to that deal because you've made the decision at the very front end of this thing. There's a problem there.
Thank you. No, and I'll include that in our show notes. So the second to last question, John, is the one question I always ask my audience or my guests is that if the DeLorean was real and there's the time machine, and what would be one thing if you can travel back 10 years ago and find your younger self, what would be one thing you would share to your younger self in that moment?
The soft skills matter.
And when you say soft skills, can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that, how you define it?
Soft skills, the way that I think about them now is they're the connective tissue that make the main skill work, right? So if you're a leader, you can know all the leadership components, you can run epic stand-ups, you can do hiring and onboarding and everything else well, but if you don't communicate to your team well, it's still going to suck. Communication is a soft skill. And because people get promoted, they think that they're good at communication, which is not always necessarily the truth. And so selling is the same thing. If you can't build trust and figure out how people want to be communicated to and how they want to be talked to and what their current view is of you, you're not going to be successful in the role, right? No matter how much value you deliver, no matter what your time to impact is, no matter how much you're discounting or anything else like this. So you really have to lean into the soft skill development.
I love it. And I feel compelled to tie this to what I said earlier. Why I use the bridge analogy, why I use the memento analogy is because when, towards your latter half of your book, you start going into the mechanics. It's actually about bridge building. It's about getting the process KPIs and stuff. So when you think about if I read it in reverse, if I was my first year into being a sales associate, I need to know what the hard skills are to know what the scorecards KPIs to measure so that I have a mechanism to know how to improve. But the soft skills you're talking about is that campfire. Can you just have a intimate one-on-one conversation as if you're around a campfire and just getting to know the person that's sitting across from you? That it's easier said than done.
Yeah, and it's easy but not simple.
Easy but not simple, right? So beautiful, beautiful. So last question, John, where can our audience find you?
Oh, yeah. So Adapted Growth is the brand. We're redoing our website. So that is coming out. But if you follow Adapted growth on any one of the social platforms, including TikTok, because we just launched on TikTok. We have some cool videos popping up there. You'll be able to get a hold of us. I'm also John Small Mountain on all the social media platforms. So if you don't remember Adaptive Growth, just think very tall guy with a small mountain, and you can also get a hold of me that way as well.
Perfect. Now, and what's the best way for our audience to reach out to you? Would it be send you a DM on LinkedIn or Instagram, or what if you have a preferred method?
Good question. I love DMs because I find that people will bring you little bitty problems before they're big problems. Like the contact form is for when you have a big defined problem. I help a lot of people out. We actually have a Slack community that has got about 60 people who I have worked with, I've networked with. We're working together in some kind of format or fashion. And honestly, that's probably the best way. But to get into there, we have to have a call first, because it's how I qualify people to determine you're going to be a good fit for the community. So so any social platform, send me a DM if you're caught on something, if you're stuck on something, if people just aren't buying at the rate that you would like to, and you think it's a very small tweak, please send me a message. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on LinkedIn. Happy to help you out. And if it's a bigger problem, then we can have a longer conversation about potentially working one-to-one or in a group format.
Awesome, man. And for my Boom Vision audience, take up on John's offer when he's saying he's offered to help, because I've gotten to know John in the last couple of weeks, and what I love about him is really we have a very similar way of just we give more than we take. And when he really says that, he really means it. So please send him a DM if you have any questions, if you're stuck, and you're trying to figure out how to ask different questions, right? That's in that regard. So with that, John, thank you so much for your time. So much you've given in this interview. I really appreciate you, and I'd love to continue on growing our relationship, man. So thank you very much, John.
Thanks for having me, man. This was rad. I appreciate it.
Wow. It felt like I just had a conversation with an old college roommate. I really hope you enjoyed today's interview. There's several nuggets of wisdom that John shared. The top 3 takeaways I got is that 1, buying is an emotional process, and we justify it with intellectual things later on. When you understand that buying is an emotional process, have you ever approached sales through an authentically and emotionally connecting with the person you're speaking with? Regardless if you're an entrepreneur or a sales professional, you need to connect with your team, your clients, or your potential customers on one of 2 things. Either you enroll them on the vision you have as an entrepreneur, or you're solving their needs as a salesperson. The second takeaway is that you will improve based on the questions you ask yourself. Just like the poker coach that John had, I agree with this statement wholeheartedly. The whole premise of Boom Vision is to help you see through a different paradigm and sharing different perspectives so that you can start asking different questions. Different questions will yield different answers that can transform your inner world, that can profoundly change your outer reality. And the third takeaway I got is that the idea of Sherpa is that it's a awareness forward sales approach versus a technique approach. I resonate with this because it's what I encourage my audience, having a more aware perspective. I love how the essence of John's book is about building integrity and trust. Integrity is the bridge analogy that I shared, and trust is the campfire. If you enjoyed today's interview, please share this episode with your family, friends, or team that can truly benefit. Hit that subscribe button for this Boom Vision podcast so that we can thrive together by building success on a rock-solid foundation of our mind, body, and soul. Until next time, folks, be kind to yourself. Be in the light. Be you. Thank you so much for tuning in to my Boom Vision podcast. If you'd like to find out more about me and this podcast, head over to benjaminyeh.com. That's spelled BenjaminYeh.com. If you haven't already, click subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.